Bergen, Norway, January 19, 1970. -9 degrees Celsius. The harbor was frozen at its edges. Fishing boats sat locked in gray ice that had been building since December, their hulls groaning under the weight of water that had refused to stay liquid. The wind came in from the North Sea without warning and without apology, carrying the kind of cold that does not ask permission before entering your lungs and taking up permanent residence there. In the mountains above the city, snow had been accumulating for 11 weeks. The paths used by hikers in summer were now buried under 2 meters of silence. The pines stood still, their branches weighted with white, and the whole landscape held the appearance of something waiting. Not resting, but waiting, the way a held breath waits before it becomes a word. Inside the Bergen Athletic Hall, a converted warehouse near the old fish market that smelled of salt and iron and wood that had been cold too long, 43 men stood in a loose circle. Most of them were large. Several were enormous. These were Norway's competitive strongmen, the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back 1,000 years to the men who crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, who dragged stone walls across frozen ground with bare hands, who did not survive winter by wishing it to be gentler. They were built by a philosophy as much as by a climate. The philosophy was simple and had never needed to be spoken aloud. What resists long enough eventually wins. At the center of that circle, holding a Viking axe, a genuine one, its iron head dark with centuries of use and its handle worn smooth by generations of hands, stood a man named Lars Gunnar Eriksson. Lars was 34 years old, 6 feet 6, 270 pounds. His forearms were the circumference of a smaller man's thigh. He had won the Norwegian National Strength Championship 4 consecutive years, and the 5th competition was already considered a formality by everyone except the other competitors. The year before, in Trondheim, he had split a spruce log with a single axe stroke while wearing competition gloves, gloves that offered no grip advantage, and the wood had separated so cleanly that the judges stopped their instruments and inspected whether the log had been pre-cut. It had not been. The wood was simply that committed to becoming 2 pieces once Lars had decided it would be. Lars was not a cruel man. He was not small-minded. He was something more specific than that. He was a man who had lived his entire life inside one reality, and that reality had never failed him. Strength was the answer. In the fjord village where he grew up, strength determined who you were, what you earned, whether the sea respected you or took you. It was not a philosophy he had chosen. It was a fact he had inherited, the way you inherit the color of your eyes. And it had been confirmed so many times by so many different versions of life that it had long since stopped being something he thought about and had become something he simply was. When word arrived that a martial artist and filmmaker from Hong Kong, a man who weighed 143 pounds and wore wire-rimmed glasses, was visiting Bergen for a series of cultural demonstrations, Lars had a single reaction. Not mockery, not dismissal, something more honest and therefore more dangerous. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He arrived at the athletic hall before dawn. He did not bring his competition gear. He brought the axe. No one had asked him to bring the axe. No one had suggested it. He lifted it from the wall of his training room where it had hung for 6 years, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it under his arm down through the frozen streets toward the harbor as the city was still dark and still silent. If you had stopped him and asked why, he could not have given you an answer that would have satisfied either of you. Some decisions live below the level of language. They belong to a part of a person that was formed before words were available, and they announce themselves through action rather than reasoning. The circle of men waited. At one end of the room, near the door that opened to the alley and let in a thin blade of frozen air when it was not fully latched, a man stood alone. He had arrived quietly. No announcement, no equipment, no preparation visible to anyone in the room. He wore a dark gray long-sleeved shirt and simple training trousers. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were open, relaxed, aimed at nothing in particular, and therefore aimed at everything. Bruce Lee was 29 years old. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because the cold had kept him from sleep, but because he had not needed more sleep than that. The first hour after waking he had spent in complete stillness, seated at the edge of his hotel bed with his hands resting on his knees, breathing in a pattern that an observer would have struggled to describe precisely. Not slow exactly, not deep exactly, more like the breathing of something that had reached a private agreement with the air it was taking in, an arrangement the body and the breath had worked out between themselves without consulting the mind. The second hour he had spent training, alone, in the hotel corridor, because the ceiling of his room was too low for the movements he needed to make. The corridor was unheated. The temperature inside it was barely above freezing. A night porter passing at 5 in the morning had found him there and had stood watching for several minutes without announcing himself, unable afterward to explain to his colleague what exactly it was he had seen. Not what the movements were. He could describe those well enough. What he could not explain was the quality of attention in them, the sense that every movement was receiving the full weight of the person performing it, that nothing was automatic, nothing was going through the motions of itself. By the time Bruce entered the Bergen Athletic Hall at 7:45, he had already done what most men require an entire training day to accomplish. But he showed none of it. He simply stood near the door with his hands at his sides and waited, the way a body of water waits, which is to say, he was not waiting at all. He was already fully wherever he was. The men in the circle looked at him. Several exchanged glances. One said something quiet to the man beside him, and that man almost smiled. They were not unkind people. They were simply confronting a visible contradiction between what they understood about physical capability and what their eyes were presenting them. Lars watched from across the room with the careful patience of a man trained by years of competition to look before committing. He studied the figure near the door, and what he saw did not reassure him, not because the man looked dangerous, but because he did not. And Lars had learned in 11 years of competition that the thing which does not look like what it is represents a specific category of problem, different from ordinary problems and requiring a different kind of attention. He carried the axe forward. The room changed. Not dramatically, not with noise. It changed the way air pressure changes when weather is about to arrive. A subtle recalibration that everyone in the room registered in their chest without being able to name it or point to its source. Lars walked to the center of the room and placed the axe head down on the stone floor. The handle stood vertical. He rested one large hand on it the way a man rests a hand on a fence post, easy and proprietorial, as if the object belonged to him in a way that transcended ownership, the way a language belongs to someone who has thought in it their entire life. He looked across the room at Bruce. He did not shout. He did not perform. He said, in Norwegian, and then in English for the benefit of the man near the door, "In this country, a challenge is made honestly. I want to understand what you are capable of. I want to see it with these eyes. If you are willing, I will come at you with this. You show me what you do." There was nothing theatrically threatening in the words themselves. The weight in the room came from the object resting against his hand, and from the 270 pounds of certainty behind it, and from the 42 other men standing in a circle watching, and from the temperature, which had dropped another degree since the doors were last opened. The weight was environmental. It was total. Bruce looked at the axe. Then he looked at Lars. Then he looked at the axe again. In that second look, several men would describe this moment later, each finding slightly different language for it. There was something that did not fit the occasion. One man said it looked like recognition. Another said it looked like acceptance. A third, older man who had been competing in Norwegian strength events since before Lars was born, said it looked like what a river looks like when it decides to go around a stone rather than through it. He said this slowly, as if working something out, and did not add anything after. Bruce nodded once. Lars lifted the axe from the floor. His grip was immediate and complete, the grip of a man who has held a particular thing 10,000 times and whose hand knows it before the brain finishes the instruction. He squared his body toward Bruce. His feet found position on the stone floor, testing it twice, the way a man anchors himself when he intends to mean something with what comes next. 42 men stopped breathing. The cold in the room was complete and unmoving. Every exhale rose as a small white cloud and dispersed in the still air above the circle. From outside, through the warehouse walls, the harbor sounds came through faintly. Ice shifting somewhere in the bay, the low sustained groan of a boat hull that had been pressed too long against the same frozen surface. Lars moved. He was fast for his size, faster than people who had not seen him before were ever prepared for. The first step transferred his full weight forward. The axe rose not in a wide overhead arc, but in a tight diagonal line, angled for efficiency rather than display. This was not a performance movement. Lars had split enough wood in enough whether to know the difference between a movement that looks powerful and a movement that is powerful, and he was not interested in the first kind. The distance between them closed to nothing in 2 seconds. And then something happened that the men in that room would spend years attempting to explain to people who had not been there, never quite managing it, because the language they had available was not built to hold it. Bruce was not where he had been. He had not leaped backward. He had not ducked. He had moved in the only direction that made the axe's path irrelevant. Forward and to the left, not away from the threat, but past it, into the empty space beside it. The space the axe could not occupy while it was already committed to the direction it had been given. He had stepped into the geometry of the problem and found the one coordinate where the problem could not follow. In the same motion. This is the detail that broke the understanding of everyone watching. His right hand found Lars's wrist. Not the axe. The wrist. The hinge. The precise location where intention becomes object, where the man ends and the weapon begins. His fingers did not grip. They arrived. They made contact with a quality that suggested not speed, but inevitability, as though the hand had always been going to that exact point, and everything else in the movement had simply been the body catching up to where the hand already knew it was going. Lars's wrist turned. A small rotation, perhaps 30 degrees. In a man of ordinary strength, 30 degrees of wrist rotation means almost nothing. In a man whose entire system of force was built on commitment and follow-through, it meant that the axe went where the wrist went rather than where the intention had sent it. The two had been synchronized for the entire approach. Now they were not. The axe passed through empty air. Lars's body carried 270 pounds of momentum that his mind had not yet been informed would find no destination. His feet searched for position on stone they had already left. His weight continued forward in the direction of something that was no longer there. For one suspended moment, a moment that everyone present would remember with unusual precision for the rest of their lives. 270 pounds of organized Norwegian strength stood at the exact center of its own unresolved force with nowhere to put it. 5 seconds had passed since Lars first moved. The axe was in Bruce's hand. Not taken, not snatched, delivered, in a manner of speaking, by the geometry of the situation. Bruce held it by the handle, head down, at his side, with the same settled ease that Lars had held it against the floor 10 minutes before. The room was silent. Not the silence of an audience that knows what it is watching. The silence of 43 minds arriving simultaneously at the outer boundary of what they thought they understood, and stopping there, and not yet knowing what came next. Lars stood still. He looked at his empty hand. He looked at the axe. He looked at Bruce. What was on his face was not embarrassment and not anger. It was the specific expression of a man who has just been shown a door in a room he was certain contained only walls. The expression of someone whose map has failed them, and who is standing in the territory, and who is trying to decide what to do with that information. He had come prepared for resistance. He had come prepared for retreat. He had not been prepared for cooperation, for a partner in the movement rather than an opponent to it. Bruce had not fought the axe. He had briefly joined the same system of force that the axe was part of, had become, for the duration of a single breath, the next logical thing in a sequence Lars had started, and then it stepped quietly out of that sequence at the exact moment it had nowhere useful to go. That distinction is the one that most people spend their lives unable to feel. Strength assumes the world will conform to it. This is not arrogance, or not entirely. It is a conclusion drawn from experience. When strength has been sufficient for every problem it has ever encountered, it stops being a strategy and becomes a certainty. The gap between those two things is small enough that years can pass before you notice it. And then one morning in a cold warehouse in Bergen, the gap becomes visible all at once. What Bruce carried into that room was not the opposite of strength. The corridor of a Norwegian hotel at 5 in the morning had already demonstrated what his body was capable of. What he carried was a different understanding. He had learned, through years of practice that had not been comfortable and had not been brief, that force directed against force produces only more force, that the problem of power cannot be solved by adding more power to it, only moved further along the timeline. He had learned that the most efficient response to a committed movement is not to be where that movement expected to find you. The axe, resting in his hand, was simply wood and iron. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly still. Lars crossed the room and stood in front of Bruce. He reached out his hand. Bruce returned the axe handle first, without ceremony. Lars held it. He looked at it for a moment, then set it on the floor between them, and when he looked up his voice was quiet in a way it had not been since he had entered the building. He asked how long it had taken to learn that. Bruce considered the question at the pace the question deserved. The learning is never finished, he said. But the moment you stop trying to be the thing the force breaks against, the moment you understand that the wind does not fight the cliff, something opens that was always there. Lars looked at the axe between them. The 42 men around the circle had not moved. Several were looking at the floor, not from shame, but with the inward gaze of people processing something that has landed below the level where they normally receive information. Lars bent and lifted the axe one final time. He turned it once in his hands, looking at the iron head, at the worn handle, at the object that had hung on his wall for 6 years and that he had understood, until this morning, with complete confidence. Then he held it out toward Bruce with both hands, extended forward, the way you offer something you have come to understand differently than you did an hour before. Bruce looked at it. Then he shook his head, not a refusal exactly, something softer than that. A recognition that the object was not his to carry, that it belonged where it had always belonged, that what had passed between them in 5 seconds did not live in any object. Lars lowered his arms. He held the axe against his side. He looked at Bruce with the open, uncomplicated look of a man who has received something he was not expecting and has not yet decided what to do with it, but knows, with certainty, that he will not put it down. Outside, the wind moved across the harbor without resistance. The ice in the bay shifted along its own invisible fault lines. The pines above Bergen stood under their accumulated weight of snow, perfectly still, bending only in the precise moments when the air asked them to, and returning, and bending again, and returning, without breaking. Lars Gunnar Eriksson walked out of the Bergen Athletic Hall that morning carrying the same axe he had arrived with. But the man carrying it had changed in the way that men rarely change. Not through argument, not through loss, but through a moment so precisely placed that it could not be argued with or undone or put back the way it had been before it happened. He never spoke to journalists about what took place in that room. He did not need to. The 42 men who stood in the circle that morning did not speak publicly about it either. But over the years that followed, a quiet thing moved through Bergen's athletic community the way a current moves through deep water, invisible from the surface, but present in everything the water eventually reaches. Training methods shifted, not dramatically, not with announcement, a little less force and a little more attention. A different quality of listening to what was actually in the room, rather than what you had planned to put there. It was the kind of change that arrives without explaining itself. The kind that a river makes when it finds a new way to the sea. No headline was ever written about it. That is always how the deepest things travel.